Hey, it's Andy Meadows, radio consultant and host of Radio Influencers. One of the things I've really loved about hosting this podcast is getting to talk to some really successful and talented radio people about how they got into radio. So, as you'll see, I do ask that question quite a bit because I think it's helpful information for people wanting to get into radio. And it's also a good reminder for those of us who have been doing radio for a long time why we got into the business in the first place and why we've stayed in it for so long. Watch how people's eyes light up when they talk about those early days in radio. I think we could all be better served if we recaptured some of that magic and paired it with the knowledge and experience we've gained along the way. And so this is part one of a two-part series we're going to do on radio origin stories. And if you have one of your own you would like to share, put it on video and email it to me at andy@radiostationconsultant.com, and we'll try to put it in part two if we can. So here is part one. Hope you like it. And I want to come back to that because you made a couple good points there. But first, can you kind of give them your radio origin story, like how you got into this crazy business
Oh man,
we're in?
it's been a long time, Andy. I actually got into radio. I was going to University of Minnesota, growing up there, and listening to one of my favorite radio shows. It was the Heinz and Berglund show on what was then WLOL 99.5 is a top 40 station. And it was a very cold Minnesota morning, and I was sitting in my bedroom in my dad's basement, basically, and I did not really want to get up and get in the car and drive to campus. And I was listening to the radio, and Heinz and Berglund were then talking about then President Ronald Reagan. And I had always, as a child, kind of played with voice impersonations. And I knew Ronald Reagan was a voice I could do, and so I called the radio station as Ronald Reagan, and their producer put me on hold, and the next thing I knew, I was on the radio and doing a little bit back and forth with the guys, and they kind of threw me some softballs, so it was pretty easy to know where the joke needed to land or what I needed to say, and we finished our little thing on the air, and John Hines, one of the hosts, said, "Hey, can you, Mr. President, could you hold for a moment?" And they went into commercials, and he came on the phone. And he goes, "Who are you?" and I told him what I was doing. He goes, "Do you do any other voices?" And I said, "Yeah, I do this and that, blah blah blah." And he said, "What are you doing today?" I said, "Well, I go to the University of Minnesota. I'm going to class." And he goes, "Why don't you skip that and come to lunch with me?" And and I did. And lo and behold, I started doing regular stuff for their show and other stations around the country. In fact, at one point, I think I was the voice of Ronald Reagan on like 20 radio stations. And I used to sit on the edge of my bed and get paid to do that. And I thought, this radio thing is great. I mean, I was studying journalism at school, so it wasn't
so it's
a
not
stretch.
too far off.
Yeah. I was kind of on that path anyway, but it was like, wow, this is fantastic. So that's what got me into it. And then I was on the air and eventually realized that I was probably a better coach than I was a player, and moved into programming, and the rest is history. So, but that's how I started in radio.
And one of the big things I wanted to talk to you about is teamwork, because you guys do such a great job. With that, you're a good example of why teamwork is important to a show. But before we get into all that stuff, can you kind of tell them your radio origin story, how you got into this crazy business?
Yeah, the nutshell version is that I'm a fan first. I fell in love with it as a kid. I would wake up early for school just so I can be with the radio. I would throw the cassette tape in the radio and record whatever I could, and then I'd run off to school with the Walkman on, try to listen in class, then run right back home to the tape and try to see how much I missed. And I was hoping like there wasn't a huge commercial break on the tape, that somehow like I just caught a huge stretch of content. And I just really became obsessed with it, and I don't know why sometimes why I was drawn to it, other than I just had fun listening to it, and it felt like an extension of my friend circle. Like these were people I really felt like I knew, and I loved it so much that at some point I started asking a bunch of questions and asking people, how do I even get into this? It just felt like this far off dreamland.
Sure.
And someone gave me some really great advice and said, you should just call all the local college radio stations in your neighborhood. And so I called so many of them, and almost none of them got back to me. There was one radio station called WFDU, which is on the campus of Fairleigh Dickinson University. They called me and said, hey, if you want to run Sunday morning public affairs programs, you can come on in and do that. And so my mom would drive me to the radio station. I didn't even have my license. And she dropped me off at 5 a.m, and I got trained for that shift from about 5 to 10.
Yeah, and you did get your start in radio. Can you kind of tell them your radio origin story before we get into all the sales talk?
I love that you call it an origin story. That's great. Yeah, I'm 25 years in now. I was a University of Florida grad, and I came to Atlanta to visit on a girlfriend who had graduated a semester earlier than me. And she was working at JWT. And to show you what life was like 25 years ago, after lunch, we went and sat at her desk and literally went card by card through her Rolodex, looking at all of her contacts. And I spent the afternoon faxing my resume out. And I was really actually lucky. It was kind of kismet. I got preferential placement on someone's desk at InterRep Atlanta. And they were looking for a sales assistant. And I started at McGavran Guild 25 years ago. And here I am. We're a different version of McGavran Guild, but a lot of the same stations, a lot of the same players, a lot of evolution between then and now.
I remember that, man, that fax machine was so frustrating. It was sitting there, especially when everyone would send their copy that way and having to wait for it. Yeah.
The fax machine. I mean, we had huge desktops at everybody's desk, and I remember thinking, wow, this is so of the moment. And now you don't have a laptop that you can grab and go. Who are you?
Yeah, I had somebody quit via fax one time, and I thought that was kind of unique.
Handwritten, I quit.
But before we get into all that, can you tell me a little bit of your radio origin story, how you got into this silly business?
Yeah, it's a good one. I started at a small station in Rockland County, and then in New York, and quickly I landed up WPLJ, which is luck of the Irish, they would say. I was driving a limo on the side, and a guy I used to drive, this gentleman Jim O'Grady, his son's friend was coming from Providence, Rhode Island to run WPLJ. His name was Mitch Dolan, and I was Mitch's first hire on the sales side. So I worked at PLJ for 3 years, and then I moved over to WABC as a local sales manager, and then kind of moved up the ranks where I ran sales for ABC and PLJ, and then eventually became GM of WABC, which I was GM for 9 years at 77 WABC in New York.
Yeah.
Thereafter, we got bought by Citadel, and I was running an ESPN station at the same time, so I decided to stay with ESPN, where I stayed till 2 years ago before I came over to the Broadcasters Foundation. So I ran the owned and operated ESPN stations.
So it all started in a limo, is what you're telling me.
Started in a limo, like many things do, Andy. I mean, how many things start in a limo and end in a limo?
This episode is going to be, the title of it's going to be Positivity, because you are one of the most positive people, A, I've ever met in my life, B, that I've ever worked with, and that's so contagious within an organization, and it's so helpful. But before we get to that, I kind of want to back up a little bit and get your radio origin story. Like,
okay, yeah.
Tell me how you got into this crazy business.
It is a crazy business, and it's all I've ever done, all I ever know, and I'm thankful it's worked out as long as it has. When I was 15, I was babysitting couples' kids across the street from us, and I got a call from my mom who said, Ken Roberts, who is the general manager of our hometown radio station in Waxahachie, is trying to find you and wants to know if you would want to come down and have a radio show on Saturday night. I was like, Mom, yes. Call him back and say yes. Because I had been bugging him over the years. My grandfather would take me to ball games and watch him broadcast and would take me into the radio studio, and I fell in love with radio. So I wanted a job in radio. I told him I'd do anything. And so I got a job when I was, 16, doing an all request Saturday night show on a classic country radio station in my hometown of Waxahachie. And it started from there, and I've been in love with it ever since.
Before we get too far into that, though, I kind of like to start at the beginning, talking about letting people talk about their origin story, how they kind of got into this crazy business. And I know somewhat of yours, but can you tell them, how you got into radio?
Yeah, so I'm actually fourth generation. I3G Media actually stands for Inkstead Third Generation.
Oh, right.
So basically going back to the beginning, my great grandpa Robert Inkstead started KOVC along with other business owners in Valley City out of the Rudolph Hotel, and that was in 1936. So it's been around forever. And then after that, my grandpa, Robert Inkstead, took that over. And then the third generation, which would be my father, Robert Inkstead, my uncle, Todd Inkstead, and my aunt, Tally Coville, they became ownership. And then I was brought in 3 years ago, and I became the fourth generation. And now my brother's actually interning here. He graduates in May, and he will also be hopefully a part of the fourth generation here. But so I guess the reason that I really wanted to come into radio was because I grew up with a room that shared a wall with my dad's office, and I heard him talk the good, the bad, the ugly, all sorts of business calls, maybe some that I probably shouldn't have heard, but kind of just everything. And I thought that business entrepreneurship was so interesting, and the way that he thought about things. And I found it so interesting to hear him talk, whether he was talking to me or talking on the phone to someone, whether we're in the car, or whether I was in my room at home, just listening to him and his thoughts. I just found it so interesting. So as I got older and I went to college, and I went for marketing, and I wanted an opportunity to at least figure out if I wanted to be in radio or not.
Sure.
I started doing an internship here at I3G Media, and I kind of just dove into a million different things. So I've done so many different things, whether it's traffic, whether it's production, accounting, just so many different parts of the business to kind of be like, oh yeah, this is something that I'm very interested in and want to see grow and thrive and all of that stuff. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then right after college, basically the day after I graduated, I was full-time. So it's kind of just gone from there.
Well, and you've got me beat. So I'm only second generation radio. So you got me beat by quite a bit, but I can relate to that story about being next to your dad's office, because there was a point where I actually lived next to the transmitter. We had an AM FM, and the AM was next to my room, so I would hear country music all day and night.
And then pretty soon you know all the lyrics to every song too.
I can't help. If I ever go on Jeopardy and 80s 90s country is the category, I will crush it. But want to talk to you about a lot of stuff on the sales side, but before we get into all that, can you tell them your radio origin story?
Yeah, let's go back to the early beginnings. So in camp, when I was 8 years old, in Graham, Washington, right outside of Puyallup, with a view of Mount Rainier, there was a small building in the middle of the campground that had a big speaker that broadcast out to the entire campground, and they had an hour-long slot you could sign up for, and they called it a radio station, and I found myself in there with a mic playing Drift Away by Dobie Gray on a 45 over and over again.
Great tune.
And I was kind of hooked. But from there, at San Diego State University in telecommunications and film school, I found myself on KCR, K-Campus Radio, which had a booming 1-watt signal into the dorms. And I did a morning show with a guy named Tony Finn. and fell in love with it there. And I did everything from spin music to read news, and was completely captivated by radio.
Well, that's interesting because I asked this question of everybody, and it seems like so many people are bit by the bug at a very early age. But you're
Fair
the first
enough,
you're the first at camp at 8 years old. So, so one of the main things I wanted to talk to you about, kind of, I wanted to get a highlight some of the articles that you've written that I love. You know, and some of them I agree with you 100%. Some of them I don't, and that's what I love about what we're doing at Radio Update is the different opinions that we're sharing.
Sure. Yeah.
But before we get into all that, can you kind of tell them your radio origin story, how you got into this business?
Sure. I actually went to school, college for elementary education, and came back on summer vacation and got a job at a radio station as like a part-timer promotions person. Mm-hmm. And then that was 2004. And then within about 6 months, I was mornings with the morning host on a hip hop station.
Wow, that's a quick journey.
Yeah, it went fast. And then from there, I wanted to make sure, because I know that the more hats you wear, the better utilized you are. Yes. So I wanted to do everything. So I got involved in the commercial traffic department at the same time, and I was helping with production. And then I was on a couple other stations. So I was doing as much as possible to make it so that they kind of needed me and wouldn't give me the boot.
Sure. Make yourself hard to fire, I always say.
Yeah. Exactly. And then I went from there. Our station got sold to another company. And then I went into Fort Myers, Florida, and I did rock radio down there, and came back and did Kiss FM in the area, and then did mornings again. And so I just got out of local radio last year.
Now, I wanted to have you on because, of course, we're in an election year, and so everyone wants to know how to get their hands on some of those sweet political ad dollars. But before we get too far into that, can you tell them a little bit of your radio origin story?
Well, I am a radio guy since age 11. Originally,
11?
11, yeah, that's young. I wanted to be Walter Cronkite, and my dad said, there's a lot of people who would want that job, and why don't you get some experience? And that there's a radio station down the street, so see what you can do for them. And so at a young age, I was the studio engineer for high school football games on WEEF, AM and FM in Highland Park, Illinois. And then when my voice changed, they let me go on the air, and then I was a disc jockey. And
it's always a big day, isn't it? When your voice changes and they're ready to put you behind a mic.
Yep. But I only lived 3 blocks from the station, so they had me sign the stations on Saturday and Sunday morning so that their full-time employee could sleep in. I don't think that would fly today, but we do.
How did you transition into sales?
Well, quickly I saw that the people who were doing better at the station were the people involved in sales and management. So I switched my sights from journalism to sales, and I've been doing that ever since.
Kind of like to start with your radio origin story. Can you tell people like how you got into this crazy business?
Well, I've been in radio almost from almost as early an age as you were, except for you were born into it. So I didn't get into it until I was 13. I grew up in central Nebraska in a small farming community, and was a baseball player. And the local hometown radio station, 1,000 watts daytime station, came on at sunrise and went off at sunset. Carried our games, and the general manager was the one who did play-by-play, and he would interview me after games. I was a pretty good baseball player, and one time on the air, he asked me, he said, "Well, what do you want to do when you get older?" I said, "I'm going to play baseball." And he said, "Well, what if that doesn't work out and you don't make the major leagues?" He goes, "Then I'm going to do major league play-by-play on the radio like you." And he goes, "You interested in the radio?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." And he said, "Why don't you come in tomorrow and I'll show you how it works." I went into the radio station the next day and watched him for an hour, and he showed me how everything worked and what he was doing. And he said, "Okay, you're on for the next hour. I'll be back in my office." I'm 13. I'm almost 14 years old. And I was like deer in headlights. I had no idea what I was doing. I was running back to his office every couple of minutes, asking a question. He'd come in and help me out. But I got the bug and was on the air.
You were bit.
Yeah.
But I got the job and stayed on the air from the time I was almost 14 all the way through high school, and it got me a job on the air in Lincoln, Nebraska, under the University of Nebraska, which turned into a program director job when I was 21. Right place at the right time, and learned a lot. I did mornings and programmed KFRX in Lincoln for 8 years. I had a good run of success. And the more I learned about what it takes to really succeed on the air, from a personality and promotion standpoint, the more I realized that I didn't have that key ingredient that was going to make me wildly successful, and that's talent. So I decided I have to get myself off the air and focus on management and programming. And I took a job in Kansas City as an assistant program director at a top 40 station, which was a great education for me. I was there for a little over a year, and then went to Jacksonville, Florida, which was a great career mistake. Was there for 6 months, just long enough to buy a house, move my family into it, and then get fired. But the day that happened, I got a call from Alan Burns of Alan Burns and Associates, who said, "I've always had my eye on you as a programmer, and I think you'd make a great consultant. Would you like to come and join me?" And I took the job, moved to the Washington, D.C. area, and Alan took me under his wing and taught me how to be a consultant, mostly by observing how he did it, and shared with me his philosophies and how he works with stations. And
which is really the only way to learn it.
It is. It's completely different, and it's a completely different application of programming ability and programming skills, and the knowledge and the creativity that you have applying it in a whole different way. So I did that for 3 years, and at that time our oldest son Andrew was about to go into kindergarten, and I was traveling all the time because I developed a pretty good client list. And we decided I don't want to be traveling and miss birthday parties and watch my kids grow up. So I took a job as program director at Q106 in San Diego, and led a station from 19th to 1st in 6 months.
Wow.
We literally went worst to first, took a station that had really fallen apart, and we did it through two things: personality and promotion, with a good music mix that balanced it. But it was all about really making connections in the community. That was wildly successful. A couple of years later, they decided they didn't need what they considered to be an overpaid program director, because Jacor had purchased the stations, and they had their own programmers that they wanted to move in, and they were cutting budget even back then in 1994. So I went over to the station that we had destroyed by hiring their morning show, Jeff and Jer, and they were 22nd in the market, and I repeated the worst to first. We went from 22nd to first in about a year and a half. I eventually became market manager of that group of stations, and stayed at the KFMB stations in San Diego up until 2007. Left, got out of day-to-day radio in 2007 and joined Triton Media, and was their executive vice president.
Is that the same as Triton Digital?
Yeah, it was Triton. It was Triton at the time, and they changed their name to Triton Digital later. But I was the executive vice president of audience engagement for them for 4 years, and my job was to help radio stations on the air, off the air, and in social media to build their database, connect with listeners on the air, turn that into revenue sources. And I worked with about 200 radio stations in that 4 years of doing that. 2011, I had the opportunity to start coaching a group of morning shows that I had met through contacts before, and I thought, it's a great time to hang out my own shingle and start the Tracy Johnson Media Group in 2011. I've been doing that ever since.
Thanks for listening to this best of episode of Radio Influencers. We'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern.